Welcome back, listener. Tonight, we're drifting slowly through the tragic story of the Afton family, a household that began like many others in 1970s America, but descended into a nightmare of death, possession, and cycles of violence that would echo across decades. From William Afton's charming exterior hiding monstrous impulses, to a mother whose fate remains shrouded in mystery, to three children whose lives were cut short or twisted beyond recognition, we'll trace every thread of this family's unraveling, exploring how ambition, negligence, cruelty, and tragedy transformed ordinary people into the central figures of horror. How a family that should have had birthday parties and graduations instead had murders and hauntings, and how the bonds between parent and child, between siblings, became chains that trapped them in cycles of death and seeking that lasted far beyond natural lifespans. This is not a story of triumph or redemption, though redemption was sought by some, but rather a meditation on how families fracture, on how one person's choices ripple through generations, on how love can be twisted into something unrecognizable, and on how the Afton family, more than any haunted animatronic or possessed location, became the true heart of the FNAF tragedy. Each member both victim and, in some cases, perpetrator of horrors that would define the entire franchise. Whether you're discovering the Afton family's story for the first time, letting familiar tragedies pull you deeper into rest, or simply allowing the narrative to wash over you like a gentle fog as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the complete, unbroken history of William, Mrs. Afton, Michael, Elizabeth, and the crying child. A family destroyed by its patriarch's obsessions and bound together in death more tightly than they ever were in life. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dark dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet wonder to see the same tragic tale weaving through different corners of the world, one hushed night at a time. Let's begin this exploration of the Afton family, a household where every member would be touched by death, where no one escaped unmarked, and where family bonds became prison chains that lasted beyond mortality itself. Part 1. The Foundation Before Everything Fell Apart. In the late 1970s, in the modest town of Hurricane, Utah, the Afton family lived in a house on a quiet street where children played and neighbors waved to each other from porches, and nothing suggested that this household would become the epicenter of tragedy. William Afton, the patriarch, was known as a brilliant engineer and entrepreneur, a British immigrant who had found success in America through innovation and partnership with Henry Emily, creating animatronic entertainment that captured children's imaginations. His wife, whose first name has been lost to time or perhaps deliberately obscured, managed the household, raising 3 children while her husband spent long hours at Fredbear's Family Diner and the nascent Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, building an empire of family entertainment. The children were, in birth order, Michael, the eldest, a boy who would grow to be perhaps 10 or 11 by the time of the family's first tragedy, old enough to understand cruelty but not consequence. Elizabeth, the middle child, a girl with the father's curiosity and a fascination with the animatronics that would prove fatal. And the youngest, a boy whose name is debated among those who study the lore, called the crying child by some, Evan by others, perhaps named after someone important, or perhaps simply another child whose identity was lost in the catastrophe that consumed him. From the outside, the Afton family appeared successful, prosperous, a model of achievement in the growing field of entertainment technology. William's partnership with Henry Emily had produced revolutionary spring-lock animatronics, and the restaurants were becoming popular destinations for birthday parties and family outings. Money was not a concern. The house was comfortable. The children had toys and clothes, and Mrs. Afton could maintain their home without financial stress. By external measures, the Aftons had succeeded, had achieved the American dream, had built something substantial and real. But beneath this exterior, fractures ran deep through the family's foundation, invisible to outsiders but profoundly felt by those within the household. William, despite his professional success, was an absent father, his attention consumed by his work to the point where his children became background figures in his life, people he provided for but did not truly know, did not genuinely nurture. His wife, whose perspective is largely absent from the historical record, bore the burden of essentially single-parenting 3 children while maintaining the fiction that they were a complete family, that William's absence was normal, that his coldness was simply British reserve or professional focus rather than fundamental emotional disconnection. Michael, as the eldest, felt his father's absence most acutely, developing behavioral problems that manifested as cruelty toward his younger brother, seeking attention through negative means when positive attention was not available, acting out in ways that suggested a boy desperate for his father to notice him, to respond to him, even if that response was anger or discipline rather than the indifference that characterized William's usual interaction with his children. Michael wore masks, literal masks of the Freddy characters, transforming himself into the animatronics his father cared about more than his own family, as if by becoming the thing William loved, Michael might finally earn the attention he craved. Elizabeth, by contrast, sought her father's approval through emulation, becoming interested in robotics and engineering, asking questions about how the animatronics worked, wanting to understand what captured so much of William's focus and energy. She saw her father's work as a way to connect with him, to share his interests, to build a bridge across the emotional distance that separated William from his family. Her fascination with the animatronics, particularly with Circus Baby, whom William had designed ostensibly for her, was rooted not just in childish wonder, but in the deeper need to understand her father, to find common ground, to be noticed by the man whose attention was so difficult to capture. The youngest child, the crying child, responded to the family dynamics with fear and withdrawal, developing anxiety that manifested particularly around the animatronics his father created, seeing in their mechanical movements and lifeless eyes something threatening, something wrong, something that his young mind couldn't articulate but his emotions responded to with primal terror. His nightmares were vivid and frequent, featuring animatronics transformed into monsters, Freddy and his friends becoming creatures with sharp teeth and grasping hands, the characters of entertainment becoming figures of horror in a child's subconscious that perhaps understood, better than his conscious mind could, that something was fundamentally wrong with his father's creations, with his father's work, with his father himself. Mrs. Afton, caught in the middle of this deteriorating family structure, tried to maintain normalcy, to provide the emotional warmth that William could not or would not offer, to mediate between Michael's bullying and the crying child's terror, to encourage Elizabeth's interests while protecting her from dangers she was too young to recognize, to hold together a household that was slowly fracturing under the weight of William's negligence and obsessions. The strain showed in ways that were visible to anyone who looked closely. Exhaustion in her eyes, stress in her voice, the gradual dimming of whatever spark had attracted her to William in the first place. The slow realization that she had married a man capable of providing everything except the emotional presence that makes a house a home. This was the Afton family before the tragedies began, before death visited the household repeatedly, before each member would be marked by horror in ways that transformed them irrevocably. They were not yet the figures of FNAF lore, not yet the names that would be whispered in connection with murder and haunting and cycles of violence, but simply a family with problems, with distance between members, with a father who cared more about animatronics than children, and children who were learning, each in their own way, that their father's love was conditional at best and entirely absent at worst. Let this understanding of the family's foundation settle over you gently now. The knowledge that the Aftons began as people, as a household with normal problems magnified by William's particular brand of emotional absence, as children seeking attention and a mother trying to compensate for her husband's failures, as the raw material from which tragedy would sculpt something far darker, far more painful, far more lasting than any of them could have anticipated as they went about their daily lives in Hurricane, Utah, unaware that death was already circling their family, drawing closer with each passing day, preparing to strike in ways that would destroy them individually and bind them together in aftermath. Part 2. The Crying Child, the First Death. The youngest Afton child lived in a state of perpetual fear, his world colored by anxiety that no one in his family took seriously enough, dismissed as childish imagination or excessive sensitivity, rather than recognized as the profound terror it truly was. He was afraid of the animatronics that populated his father's restaurants, afraid of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie and the band at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, afraid in ways that went beyond normal childhood caution into something approaching phobia. Panic attacks triggered by the sight of the mechanical characters, nightmares so vivid he would wake screaming, tears streaming down his face as he tried to explain to his mother that the animatronics wanted to hurt him, wanted to eat him, wanted to do things that his young mind could barely articulate, but his emotions understood with crystal clarity. His bedroom became a prison of fear at night, shadows transforming into animatronic shapes. The darkness hiding monsters that he knew, absolutely knew, were waiting for him to fall asleep so they could emerge and do the terrible things that populated his nightmares. He slept with lights on when his parents allowed it, sought comfort from his mother when she was available, and lay awake trembling on the nights when no comfort came. When he was told to be brave, to grow up, to stop being such a baby about animated characters that were designed to bring joy to children, that couldn't possibly hurt him, that were nothing to be afraid of if he would just be reasonable. But the crying child was not being unreasonable. though no one in his family understood this. No one recognized that his fear was proportionate to a reality that adults couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge. The animatronics were dangerous, would prove catastrophically dangerous, and his terror was the appropriate response to things that should not exist. Machines that moved with too much purpose, characters that seemed to watch with more awareness than programming should provide, emanations of something wrong that his young sensory system detected, even if he couldn't explain it in terms that adults would accept. Michael, his older brother, responded to the crying child's fear not with compassion, but with mockery and escalating cruelty, seeing in his brother's terror an opportunity to feel powerful, to exercise control, to express the frustration and anger that came from his own unmet needs for attention and affection. Michael wore masks, frightening Foxy and Freddy masks, that he would don before jumping out at his brother, chasing him through the house, cornering him in his bedroom, enjoying the screams and tears that resulted, the feeling of dominance over someone weaker, the perverse satisfaction of causing fear, even as some part of him must have recognized that what he was doing was not play, but genuine torment. The bullying extended beyond the home, Michael enlisting friends who shared his cruelty or simply followed his lead. A small group of boys who wore animatronic masks and targeted the crying child at school, at the park, anywhere they could find him. Their harassment constant and escalating, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could go, how much fear they could generate, never quite recognizing or perhaps not caring that they were psychologically damaging someone, leaving scars that would never heal even if the crying child had lived long enough for healing to become possible. William's response to the situation was characteristic of his parenting: absence and dismissal. He was not present enough to witness most of Michael's bullying, too consumed with his work at the restaurants, too focused on his experiments with animatronics and the beginnings of his research into Remnant, too disconnected from his family's daily reality to understand that one of his sons was tormenting another to the point of genuine trauma. On the rare occasions when the situation was brought to his attention, when Mrs. Afton or the school contacted him about Michael's behavior, William's response was to minimize, to suggest that boys will be boys, to imply that the crying child needed to toughen up, rather than that Michael needed to stop, to essentially side with the aggressor against the victim because strength, even cruel strength, was something William understood and valued, while vulnerability, even appropriate vulnerability, was something he despised and dismissed. The crying child's upcoming birthday became a source of dread rather than excitement, because his family, in what they probably thought was therapeutic exposure, or perhaps simply convenience given William's ownership of Fredbear's family diner, decided to hold his party at the very location that terrified him most. At the restaurant with the Springlock animatronics, at the place where Fredbear and Spring Bonnie performed, where his fears were most concentrated and most intense. He begged not to go, pleaded with his mother, cried to his father on one of the rare occasions when William was home and accessible. But his protests were overruled, dismissed as more of his excessive fear, more of his need to grow up and be brave, more evidence that he was being ridiculous about animatronics that were just machines, just entertainment, just harmless characters that couldn't hurt anyone. The day of the party arrived in 1983, a date that would become infamous in FNAF lore as the day of the bite of 83, though for the crying child it began simply as the worst day of his young life, forced to attend his own birthday celebration in a location that terrified him, surrounded by animatronics that featured in his nightmares, expected to smile and enjoy himself while every instinct screamed danger, while his body shook with anxiety that no one acknowledged as legitimate, while his fear reached levels that would be recognized as panic attacks if he were an adult, but were dismissed as tantrums because he was a child who should know better. Michael and his friends, wearing their animatronic masks, circled the crying child throughout the party, taunting him, threatening to take him to see Fredbear up close, enjoying his terror in ways that suggested the cruelty had crossed from bullying into something darker, something that might have concerned adults if any adults were paying attention. But the party was busy, parents distracted by conversation and cake and the chaos of multiple children, no one watching closely enough to see that something was building toward catastrophe, that Michael's cruelty was escalating toward an act that would cross a line from which there was no return. As the party continued, Michael and his friends grabbed the crying child, lifted him despite his screams and struggles, his pleas for them to stop falling on ears that either didn't care or found his terror amusing, and they carried him toward the stage where Fredbear was performing, the animatronic's jaw moving in time to music, opening and closing with mechanical precision, revealing the darkness inside the costume, the space where a human performer could stand during spring-lock suit operations, the void that seemed to promise something terrible to a child who had nightmares about being consumed by these very machines. Michael, in what he probably thought was just a prank, just frightening his brother to teach him there was nothing to fear, lifted the crying child up to Fredbear's open mouth, perhaps intending only to bring him close, to force him to face his fear, to prove that the animatronic was harmless, that nothing bad would happen, that his little brother's terror was unfounded and ridiculous and worthy of this dramatic exposure therapy administered by cruelty rather than care. But something went wrong, catastrophically and irreversibly wrong. Whether Fredbear's spring locks failed in that moment, whether the weight of the child's head triggered mechanisms that shouldn't have been triggered, whether the animatronic was already malfunctioning, and this was simply the moment when that malfunction manifested fatally, or whether something else occurred that has never been fully explained. Fredbear's jaw closed with tremendous force, the mechanical mouth clamping down on the crying child's skull with the full power of industrial servos designed to move hundreds of pounds of animatronic components. The sound, witnesses would later report, was sickening and unforgettable. The crunch of a skull fracturing under mechanical pressure, the immediate cessation of the crying child's screams as his brain was compressed and damaged, the moment transforming from cruel prank to medical emergency to tragedy in the span of seconds, so fast that no one could react, could intervene, could do anything except watch as Michael's joke became his little brother's death, as the animatronic that had featured in nightmares became the instrument of death in waken reality, as every fear the crying child had expressed proved justified in the worst possible way. The party stopped instantly, parents rushing forward, someone calling 911. Michael frozen in horror as he realized what he'd done, his friends scattering in panic. Fredbear continuing his performance because the animatronic had no awareness that anything was wrong, that blood was dripping from his jaw, that a child was dying in front of a room full of people who had come to celebrate a birthday and were instead witnessing a death. The happy birthday song still playing from speakers as paramedics arrived and tried to stabilize a child whose injuries were catastrophic, whose skull was fractured in multiple places, whose brain showed signs of severe trauma that no treatment could fully address. The crying child was rushed to the hospital, placed on life support while doctors assessed the damage and delivered the devastating news that his prognosis was grim, that his brain activity was minimal, that even if he physically survived the injury, the person he had been was likely gone, erased by the mechanical teeth of an animatronic his father had built, killed by a machine designed to bring joy, dying slowly in a hospital bed while his family kept vigil, while Michael was consumed by guilt, while William showed whatever emotion he was capable of feeling, while Mrs. Afton fell apart watching her youngest child die by degrees. The monitors showing a heartbeat but little else. The body breathing with mechanical assistance, but the person, the frightened little boy who had known the animatronics were dangerous, already gone. He lingered for days, hovering between life and death, his hospital room becoming a space of waiting and grief. Family members taking turns sitting with him, talking to him even though he couldn't respond, hoping for improvement that never came, watching for signs of consciousness that appeared only as reflexes, as mechanical responses from a body that continued functioning, even though the mind that had inhabited it was slipping away, departing to wherever children go when they die from injuries inflicted by machines their fathers built and their brothers' cruelty activated. Then the flat line, the sound that meant the end, the monitors showing that his heart had stopped, that even with mechanical assistance his body could no longer sustain itself, that death had finally claimed him fully, and the crying child, whose name some believe was Evan, though this is never confirmed in canon, became the Afton family's first casualty. The first death in a series that would eventually consume or transform every member of the household. The opening tragedy in a cascade that would define decades of horror and haunting. His funeral was small, quiet. The family shattered by grief and guilt and the knowledge that this death was preventable, that if William had taken his son's fears seriously, if Michael had not been cruel, if the party had been held anywhere else, if Springlock animatronics had been designed with better safety mechanisms, if any of 100 small decisions had gone differently, the crying child would still be alive, would still be afraid, perhaps, but alive. Growing up, having the future that was stolen from him by negligence, compounded by cruelty, compounded by mechanical failure. A perfect storm of tragedy that no one saw coming, even though the signs were present for anyone paying attention. Michael was destroyed by guilt, understanding too late that his cruelty had killed his brother, that his actions had consequences beyond immediate gratification, that the fear he'd enjoyed causing had been justified because the animatronics were dangerous, and he'd proven it by forcing his brother into proximity with them, by creating the conditions for catastrophe, by being the architect of his siblings' death even if he hadn't intended the ultimate outcome. This guilt would define the rest of Michael's life and beyond, would drive him to spend years trying to atone, trying to undo what couldn't be undone, trying to find redemption for an act that seemed irredeemable. William's response was more complicated, harder to read, a mixture of what might have been grief with what seemed to be scientific curiosity, as if even his own son's death was primarily interesting as data about animatronic failure modes and human fragility, as confirmation of theories about consciousness and death that he'd been developing, as an opportunity to understand what happened to a person's essence when they died, in close proximity to animatronic machinery, that might, just might, capture and preserve some fragment of that consciousness through means he was only beginning to understand and would eventually call remnant. Mrs. Afton, already strained by years of emotional single parenting and her husband's absence, began to break under the weight of this tragedy, unable to process the death of her youngest child, unable to comfort Michael in his guilt because her own grief was too overwhelming, unable to connect with William, who seemed more focused on his work than his family, even in the aftermath of their son's death, unable to continue functioning normally in a world where birthday parties could end in skull fractures and mechanical deaths, and hospitals where children died slowly while families watched helplessly. And Elizabeth, the middle child, the girl who loved animatronics and wanted to understand her father's work, internalized a different lesson from her brother's death. That the animatronics were dangerous, yes, but also powerful. That they commanded her father's attention in ways his children never did. That perhaps approaching them, understanding them, even risking herself with them, was the path to finally connecting with William in ways that being his daughter had never achieved. A dangerous misreading of the situation that would lead to her own death, to her own transformation, to becoming part of the very machines that had killed her brother. Let this tragedy settle over you now like a dark blanket. The understanding that the crying child's death was the first domino falling, the first wound in a family that would eventually be destroyed entirely. The first time the Afton household discovered that William's work carried costs beyond long hours and professional stress, that animatronics could kill, that family bonds could shatter, that death could visit even when everyone thought they were safe, celebrating a birthday, just trying to have fun, never imagining that this normal day would end in catastrophe that changed everything forever. Drift towards sleep knowing that the crying child, whatever his name was, whoever he might have become, exists now only as tragedy, as the first child of William Afton to die, as the brother whose death haunted Michael for decades, as the son whose birthday party became a crime scene, as the boy who knew the animatronics were dangerous and was proven right in the worst possible way, as the victim whose death should have ended William's work with animatronics, but instead seemed to deepen William's obsession with death and consciousness, and the possibility that somehow, some way, death might not be permanent, that remnant might preserve something, that the crying child might, in some form, still exist somewhere in the quantum foam between life and death that William was learning to navigate and manipulate and exploit. Rest now, carrying the weight of this first tragedy, understanding that the Afton family would never recover, that this moment marked the beginning of the end, that every subsequent tragedy would be compared to this one, measured against it, understood in its context, because the bite of '83 was when the Aftons learned that they were not safe, that William's work was not harmless, that families could be destroyed in moments, that birthdays could become funerals, that crying children sometimes cry for good reason, because they know, even if they can't explain it, that danger is real and approaching and cannot be avoided, no matter how much they plead, how much they fear, how much they try to warn the adults who should protect them but don't, who should listen but won't, who should value their children's safety more than their pride or their work or their refusal to acknowledge that sometimes fear is wisdom, is appropriate, is the only sane response to things that should not exist but do, that should not kill but can, that should not be part of family celebrations but are, because William Afton built them, owned them, brought his family into proximity with them, and ultimately, through negligence and absence, allowed them to kill his youngest son. Sleep gently now, far from Fredbear's family diner, far from birthday parties that end in death, far from families breaking under the weight of preventable tragedy, safe in the knowledge that this story is not yours. This death is not your responsibility. This grief is not yours to carry, only to understand, only to witness from a distance, only to let wash over you as you drift toward rest, toward dreams that hopefully contain no animatronics, no crying children, no moments where mechanical jaws close on human flesh, no birthdays that become nightmares, no families that learn too late that their patriarch's work is dangerous, that their brother's cruelty has limits, that fear is sometimes the only rational response to an irrational world where entertainment robots can kill children while playing music, where parties can end in hospitals, where families can shatter in seconds and spend years trying to gather the pieces that will never quite fit back together the way they did before. Part 3. Elizabeth Afton. Curiosity and Circus. Baby. Elizabeth Afton, the middle child, survived her younger brother's death and carried forward in a household that was rapidly disintegrating, where her mother was falling apart, where Michael was consumed by guilt, where her father retreated even further into his work as if escaping the grief he either felt deeply or couldn't feel at all, depending on which interpretation of William Afton's psychology you subscribe to. Elizabeth was left largely alone to process the tragedy, to understand that her little brother had died in a way that confirmed his fears had been justified, that the animatronics she found so fascinating were capable of killing, and, rather than developing appropriate caution, rather than learning to fear the machines as her brother had feared them, Elizabeth instead became more curious, more determined to understand what it was about these creations that commanded so much power, so much attention, so much of her father's focus even in the aftermath of family tragedy. William, in the time following the crying child's death, developed a new project that he claimed was inspired by Elizabeth, a way to honor his daughter, or perhaps apologize for his absence, or possibly just continue his work with a new flavor of justification that made it seem less callous to build more animatronics after one had killed his son. This project was Circus Baby, an animatronic unlike the others, designed specifically to appeal to young girls with her red pigtails and colorful costume, her ability to sing and dispense ice cream, her advanced systems that made her more interactive and engaging than the older Fredbear's and Freddy's characters. A next generation of entertainment technology that William promoted as being safer, better, more suitable for birthday parties and private events. But Circus Baby, like everything William built, carried hidden purposes beyond entertainment, features that were not advertised and would not be included in any promotional materials, mechanisms that suggested her true function had nothing to do with bringing joy to children, and everything to do with William's darkening experiments. His growing obsession with remnant and consciousness and the boundaries between life and death that he was learning to map through increasingly unethical means. Inside Circus Baby's torso, concealed behind her colorful exterior, was a storage compartment accessed through a claw mechanism, a metal hand that could extend from her body ostensibly to hand out ice cream or prizes, but actually designed to grab, to pull inward, to trap whatever was placed in front of her, to open her torso and store what she captured with mechanical efficiency that suggested her true purpose was not entertainment, but capture. Not joy, but horror. Not serving children, but consuming them in ways that would allow William to study what happened to their consciousness when they died in close proximity to animatronic systems saturated with his experimental remnant. Elizabeth knew about Circus Baby, had seen her father working on her, had begged to see the animatronic up close, to interact with her, to be the first to experience what her father had built ostensibly for her. But William, in one of the few times he gave direct instruction to his daughter, forbade Elizabeth from approaching Circus Baby, told her explicitly to stay away, to not be alone with the animatronic, to maintain distance no matter how curious she was or how much she wanted to interact with the character that bore her aesthetic preferences, and seemed designed for her specifically. The warning, typically for William, came without explanation, without context, without giving Elizabeth the information she needed to understand why staying away from Circus Baby was important. Just a command to obey because he said so, because he was her father, because she was expected to follow rules even when those rules seemed arbitrary or unfair, or specifically designed to keep her away from something that had been advertised as being made for her. This approach, authoritarian and unexplanatory, virtually guaranteed that Elizabeth would eventually disobey, that her curiosity would override her obedience, that the forbidden nature of Circus Baby would make the animatronic more attractive rather than less, more interesting rather than less, something to be approached in secret since open approach was denied. The opportunity came during what was supposed to be the grand opening of Circus Baby's Pizza World, William's new venture separate from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a place where his more advanced animatronics, including Circus Baby, could be featured without Henry Emily's oversight, without the constraints of their partnership, without anyone questioning the design choices that seemed innovative on the surface, but carried sinister purposes underneath. The location was meant to be the flagship of a new franchise, the beginning of William's independent empire of entertainment venues that would eclipse what he'd built with Henry, that would prove his superiority, his vision, his ability to create something that transcended his partner's more wholesome and limited imagination. On the day of the opening, with crowds expected and preparations underway, Elizabeth found herself alone with Circus Baby, the animatronic powered on and waiting. Beautiful and inviting, offering ice cream with a mechanical voice that promised fun and treats and all the attention that Elizabeth craved from her father, but received from his creation instead. Elizabeth, drawn by curiosity and the particular rebellion of a child, told not to do something without being told why, approached Circus Baby despite William's warnings, despite whatever instinct might have suggested danger, despite the lesson she should have learned from her brother's death about the hazards of animatronics. Reaching for the ice cream that Circus Baby offered, excited and unafraid because this was made for her, designed for her father's creation bearing her aesthetic preferences, surely not dangerous, surely not something that would hurt her, surely safe despite the warnings that had lacked context and therefore lacked weight. Circus Baby's claw mechanism activated with mechanical precision, grabbing Elizabeth before she could react, pulling her forward with strength that a small girl could not resist. The animatronic's torso opening to reveal the storage compartment, the metal arms pulling Elizabeth inside while she screamed, while she realized too late that her father's warnings had been justified, that Circus Baby was not what she seemed, that the animatronic designed ostensibly to honor Elizabeth was actually designed to kill her, or kill someone, to capture and contain and do something to whoever approached too closely, to be not entertainment, but a murder weapon disguised as a children's character. William Afton's most intimate betrayal. Building a death trap that wore his daughter's favorite colors and offering it to her as if it were a gift. Elizabeth's death was instantaneous. The mechanisms inside Circus Baby not designed for comfort or slow harm, but for immediate efficiency. Crushing and containing in a single motion, the girl's body absorbed into the machinery, her blood mixing with hydraulic fluid, her remains becoming part of the animatronic's internal workings in ways that would make later maintenance grotesque and impossible. Because Circus Baby now contained Elizabeth, not just in the physical sense of body parts lodged in machinery, but in the metaphysical sense of remnant, of consciousness, of the essential pattern that made Elizabeth herself, all of it captured and bound to the circuits and metal and programming of the animatronic that had killed her. When William found Circus Baby after Elizabeth's death, after the screaming had stopped and the animatronic had returned to idle position, he discovered that his daughter was gone, but also still present. Her consciousness merged with Circus Baby's systems in ways that confirmed his theories about remnant, about consciousness persisting after death, about souls binding to the mechanisms that kill them, about everything he'd been researching and experimenting with and trying to understand through increasingly unethical means. Elizabeth was dead, but also alive, trapped inside Circus Baby, her personality fragmenting and merging with the animatronic's programming, her memories preserved but distorted, her identity becoming something hybrid, neither fully Elizabeth nor fully Circus Baby, but something new, something that would come to call itself Baby when it could speak, something that was William Afton's daughter transformed into one of his creations, the ultimate proof of his theories and the ultimate evidence of his monstrousness. Circus Baby's Pizza World closed immediately, the grand opening canceled, the location shut down before the public. ever entered, the animatronics moved to underground storage where William could access them without scrutiny, where he could study what had happened to Elizabeth, where he could continue his experiments with Remnant using his own daughter as the primary test subject, where the boundaries between scientific curiosity and paternal grief became impossible to distinguish because both impulses pointed toward the same actions: keeping Circus Baby active, monitoring her behavior, documenting the ways that Elizabeth's consciousness manifested through the animatronics systems, treating his daughter's death as data, as confirmation, as progression in his research rather than as tragedy, as loss, as something to mourn rather than study. The effect on the Afton family was catastrophic, completing the destruction that had begun with the crying child's death. Mrs. Afton, already broken by the loss of her youngest son, could not survive the loss of her daughter, could not process that 2 of her 3 children were dead, killed by animatronics her husband built, dying in circumstances that should never have occurred, that were preventable if William had shown even basic care for his children's safety, if he had prioritized their lives over his work, if he had been a father rather than an engineer who happened to have offspring. Mrs. Afton's fate after Elizabeth's death is unclear in FNAF lore, deliberately obscured or simply not important enough to the narrative to document. But the most likely scenarios are that she either left, unable to remain in a marriage to the man whose creations had killed her children, or died herself, through suicide or simply through the kind of broken heart that medicine doesn't recognize but exists nonetheless. The grief that stops people from wanting to continue living when everything they loved has been taken from them. Some theories suggest that Mrs. Afton became Ballora, another of William's animatronics, her consciousness somehow bound to the dancing figure that seemed to represent motherhood and loss in equal measure. But this theory is based more on thematic resonance than confirmed lore, a poetic interpretation that the mother who tried to hold the family together became an animatronic that dances in darkness, seeking her children, unable to rest, transformed like they were transformed, the whole family eventually becoming metal and wire and haunted systems because that's what happened to anyone who got too close to William Afton, who shared his name, who tried to love him despite his incapacity for returning that love. Michael, now the only surviving Afton child, was left to process not 1 but 2 sibling deaths. His brother killed in part due to Michael's own cruelty, his sister killed by their father's negligence and refusal to adequately warn her about dangers he'd built into his own creations, the family reduced to Michael, William, and possibly Mrs. Afton, depending on whether she survived or fled or died. A household hollowed out by tragedy, by William's obsessions, by the consequences of prioritizing animatronic research over human relationships, over family bonds, over the basic safety of one's own children. Michael's guilt, already crushing from his role in his brother's death, expanded to include survivor's guilt, the question of why he was alive when his siblings were dead, whether he deserved to survive when his actions had contributed to the cascade of tragedies, whether there was any path forward that didn't involve spending the rest of his life trying to atone for what he'd done and what his family had suffered, whether he could ever be anything other than the brother who killed his sibling through cruelty and couldn't save his other sibling from their father's machines. William, for his part, seemed to retreat even further from humanity, from emotional connection, from anything resembling normal paternal response to the deaths of his children, using their deaths as fuel for his research, as confirmation of his theories, as evidence that Remnant was real and could preserve consciousness, and that death was not the ending but a transformation, a change of state, a transition into forms that he could study and understand and eventually perhaps control or replicate or use for purposes that grew darker and more divorced from anything that could be called ethical science or normal human behavior. Elizabeth, trapped inside Circus Baby, began her own long existence as an animatronic consciousness, aware of what she had been, aware of what she had become, unable to fully die but also unable to truly live, experiencing time in fragments, her personality degrading and reforming, her memories of being Elizabeth mixing with Baby's programming, her identity becoming unstable, shifting. Sometimes she was Elizabeth Afton remembering her father and family. Sometimes she was Circus Baby executing directives. Sometimes she was something in between, confused, angry, trapped in metal, unable to escape, unable to rest, unable to even scream because animatronics don't scream, they just exist. Performing programmed routines or standing idle, conscious but not in control, aware but not free, experiencing a kind of death that was worse than ending because it continued, because it trapped her in a body that wasn't hers, in an existence that shouldn't be possible, in a nightmare that would last decades with no escape, no rescue, no way out except the destruction that she would eventually come to crave, to beg for, to see as the only mercy left available. Let Elizabeth's tragedy wash over you now like cold water, the understanding that curiosity killed the cat, that children disobey rules they don't understand, that William Afton's negligence extended to building death traps that could kill his own daughter, that families can lose multiple children to the same basic cause, that the Aftons were cursed not by supernatural forces but by William's choices, by his prioritization of research over safety, by his inability to be a father in any meaningful sense, by his creation of animatronics that seemed designed to kill, and his placement of his family in proximity to those animatronics despite knowing the danger, despite having lost one child already, despite every warning sign suggesting that perhaps, his work and his family should be kept separate, that bringing his children to his restaurants was dangerous, that building animatronics for his daughter was inappropriate, given that animatronics had already killed his son. Drift toward deeper sleep, knowing that Elizabeth Afton was a girl who wanted her father's attention, who sought connection through shared interests, who approached an animatronic that seemed designed for her, who died quickly and then spent decades trapped in the machine that killed her, who became part of the horror rather than a victim escaped from it, who would eventually turn her rage toward her father, but also toward anyone who resembled her father, who got caught in her mechanisms, who entered her space because she was Elizabeth, but she was also Baby. She was a little girl, but she was also a murder machine. She was a victim, but she would create other victims, because that's what happened when you died, and your consciousness was bound to something William Afton built. You became part of the nightmare. You perpetuated the horror. You continued the cycle because you had no choice, because the remnant that kept you conscious didn't give you freedom, just awareness, just the ability to experience your prison forever, just enough consciousness to understand what you'd lost and what you'd become, and how those two things were separated by your father's negligence and your own curiosity, and the particular cruelty of machinery designed to look inviting while being lethal. Rest now, carrying Elizabeth's story, understanding that the Afton family was down to two members, Michael and William, the son consumed by guilt and the father consumed by obsession, both of them living with ghosts literal and figurative, both of them bound by the deaths they'd witnessed or caused, both of them trapped in a family that had been destroyed by its patriarch's choices, by animatronics that killed children, by a legacy of death that was only beginning, because William was not done killing, not done experimenting, not done building animatronics and filling them with murdered children's remnant, and Michael was not done seeking atonement, not done trying to find his father and stop him, not done being punished for his childhood cruelty by a universe that seemed determined to make him suffer for it across decades, across multiple encounters with haunted animatronics, across a life that would end in fire and still not be finished, because Aftons, it seemed, did not truly die, did not fully rest, did not escape the cycles they created, just transformed, just continued in new forms, just remained bound to each other and to their family's legacy of horror and tragedy and death that spread like a stain across Utah, across decades, across every location that bore the Freddy Fazbear name or William Afton's influence. Sleep gently now, far from Circus Baby, far from storage compartments that open to reveal metal claws, far from fathers who build death traps, far from daughters who approach what they're told to avoid, far from families that learn through repetition that animatronics kill children, that William Afton cannot or will not keep his family safe, that curiosity combined with inadequate warnings equals tragedy, that middle children can die just as easily as youngest children, that the Afton family was being systematically destroyed one death at a time, each tragedy following similar patterns, each child dying in close proximity to animatronics, each death producing remnant that William studied rather than mourned, each loss bringing the family closer to complete dissolution, to becoming entirely haunted, entirely metal, entirely beyond saving because there was nothing left to save. Just ghosts in machines and survivors carrying guilt. Just fragments of what had been a family scattered across locations and decades and forms that included human, animatronic, and things in between. Part 4. Michael Afton, the brother who carried guilt. Michael Afton survived when his siblings did not, growing from the bullying older brother who wore masks and tormented a crying child into a young man defined entirely by guilt, by the need to atone, by the mission to find his father and somehow undo the cascade of horrors that had destroyed their family. The years after Elizabeth's death and their mother's departure or death saw Michael living with William, or perhaps living near William, or perhaps already separated from William, the timeline unclear, but the relationship certainly strained if it existed at all. Father and son both damaged by the family's tragedies, both processing loss in completely different ways. William retreating into his research and experiments while Michael tried to understand what had happened to his family, what his father had become. what he himself needed to do to address the weight of responsibility that threatened to crush him. Michael's guilt was comprehensive, covering not just his direct role in his brother's death, but also his failure to protect Elizabeth, his inability to see what his father was, his participation in a family structure that had enabled William's negligence, his every moment of normalcy after his siblings' deaths, as if being alive when they were dead was itself a form of betrayal, as if surviving was a crime that required punishment, as if the only acceptable path forward was complete dedication to atonement, regardless of personal cost, regardless of danger, regardless of whether atonement was even possible for someone who had killed his brother through cruelty and failed to save his sister from their father's machines. At some point, the exact timing debated among lore scholars, Michael made a decision that would define the rest of his existence. He would find his father, would track down William Afton wherever he had gone, whatever he was doing, and would stop him, or confront him, or understand him, or simply bear witness to what William had become. The specifics of Michael's goal probably evolving as he pursued it, but the core mission remaining constant. Finding William, facing William, addressing the broken relationship between father and son, between the man who had created horrors and the boy who had lived through their consequences. This quest led Michael to employment at various Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations, taking night guard positions and other roles that put him in contact with the haunted animatronics, with the children his father had murdered, with the systems and structures that William had built or corrupted. Michael moving from location to location using different names. Mike Schmidt at one point, Michael Afton at others, perhaps other aliases in other places, always looking for traces of his father, always trying to understand what William had done, always placing himself in danger because danger was what he deserved, because surviving when others died required punishment, because the only path to redemption led through the same darkness his father had created. The animatronics recognized something in Michael, perhaps saw in him echoes of William Afton, perhaps sensed through remnant-based perception that this was the son of their murderer, perhaps simply attacked him because he was an adult in a security uniform and they attacked all adults in security uniforms, their programming or possession driving them to hunt night guards, regardless of whether those night guards were innocent of the crimes that had led to their deaths. Michael survived encounters that should have killed him, whether through skill or luck or the particular irony that he was trying to be killed, seeking punishment through dangerous employment, and therefore somehow dodging death that found those who wanted to live. The universe's dark sense of humor, ensuring that the one person seeking death through animatronic encounters was the one person who kept surviving them. His search eventually led him to Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, the underground facility where William stored the fun-time animatronics including Circus Baby herself, the animatronic containing Elizabeth's consciousness, Michael's dead sister now trapped in metal, aware and angry and driven by directives that included escape, that included using anyone who entered the facility, that included pretending to help while actually manipulating. Because Elizabeth was not fully Elizabeth anymore, was Baby, was something created by the merger of a little girl's consciousness with programming designed to capture and kill, and that merger had produced something that was both victim and predator, both seeking help and willing to betray anyone who offered it. Michael took a job at Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, likely believing he could find information about his father there, perhaps hoping to encounter or rescue Elizabeth if she was somehow still alive in some form. Not understanding that Elizabeth was Circus Baby, that his sister had become one of the animatronics, that the voice helping him navigate the facility was the voice of his dead sister wearing metal and speaking through speakers, pretending to help him when actually she was guiding him toward a fate that would transform him just as she had been transformed. The facility was a death trap, each night bringing Michael closer to the scooping room, the place where animatronic endoskeletons were removed or installed, where maintenance was performed on the fun-time animatronics, where a device called the scooper waited, ostensibly for animatronic maintenance, but actually for something far worse. A purpose that Baby would reveal as she guided Michael through his final night, telling him that she and the other animatronics wanted to escape, needed to escape, had a plan to escape. And that plan required Michael's cooperation, required him to reach the scooping room, required him to trust his sister even though his sister was not entirely his sister anymore, was something that shared Elizabeth's memories but did not share Elizabeth's moral constraints, did not feel the sisterly love that would prevent her from doing what she was planning to do. Baby explained, her voice sweet and reasonable and completely matter-of-fact, that the animatronics wanted to leave the facility, wanted to see the surface, wanted to experience life beyond their underground prison. But they couldn't leave in their current forms, were too recognizable as animatronics, too obviously not human, would be stopped or reported or returned to the facility if they tried to simply walk out. But if they had a suit, a human body to wear, a disguise that would let them pass as normal people, then they could escape, could leave, could be free, and they had found the perfect suit. Michael himself, his human body the vehicle they needed, and all they had to do was remove what was inside that body, scoop out the organs and bones and material that made Michael human, leaving a hollow skin suit that the animatronics could wear, that would disguise their metal endoskeletons, that would allow them to walk out of the facility and into the world beyond. Michael, whether through guilt or fatalism or simple resignation to whatever fate awaited him, walked into the scooping room despite knowing what was about to happen, despite understanding that Baby's plan required his death, despite recognizing that his sister was about to kill him, perhaps believing he deserved it for his role in his brother's death, perhaps hoping that this would be his atonement, his final punishment, the end of his guilt-ridden existence, perhaps simply too tired and broken to resist, to fight back, to choose survival over the comfortable finality of letting Elizabeth have his body, of giving his sister the escape she wanted even if it meant his own destruction. The scooper activated, a mechanical arm with a scooping device on the end, designed ostensibly to remove animatronic endoskeletons, but actually capable of removing human organs, of tearing out everything inside Michael's torso, his heart and lungs and intestines and stomach, all of it scooped out and deposited on the floor of the room while Michael stood frozen, experiencing pain beyond description, beyond what human consciousness is designed to process, beyond anything he'd ever imagined when he'd thought about punishment and atonement, and what he deserved for killing his brother. This was so much worse than quick death. This was disembowelment while conscious removal of everything that kept him alive. Death approaching but not arriving quickly enough. Not ending the pain, just letting it stretch out as his body realized it should be dead, should stop functioning, should shut down because you cannot survive being scooped. You cannot live without your organs. You should die. And Michael was dying, but something prevented complete death. Some factor he didn't understand. Some force that kept a spark of consciousness active even as his body failed comprehensively. Then the animatronics, led by Baby, led by Elizabeth wearing metal and speaking in mechanical tones, entered Michael's body, filling the hollow space the scooper had created, using his skin as a suit, wearing him like clothing, their combined endoskeletons creating a horrific amalgamation that called itself Enard. 5 animatronics merged together, controlling Michael's limbs like a puppet, keeping his skin alive through means that were either remnant or willpower, or simply the universe's refusal to let Aftons die easily. Walking Michael's body out of the facility, into the world, experiencing freedom while Michael's consciousness remained somehow active, trapped inside his own skin that was being worn by his sister and her companions, experiencing what it was like to be possessed in the most literal sense, to be a skin suit, to be the vehicle for others' escape, to be used and discarded, and yet somehow still aware, still present, still Michael, even though Michael should be dead, should have ended in that scooping room, should not have survived having his organs removed and his body stolen by animatronics. Enard wore Michael for weeks, using his body to move through the world, experiencing human existence through stolen flesh. But Michael's body was rotting, decomposing despite being animated, turning purple as bacteria consumed dead tissue, attracting attention because people noticed that something was wrong with Mike, that he looked sick, looked wrong, looked increasingly like a corpse walking around pretending to be alive. And eventually Enard realized that Michael's body was failing as a disguise, was drawing more attention than it avoided, was becoming a liability. And so, one night in Michael's bathroom, in his home that he'd returned to while wearing animatronics inside his skin, Enard ejected, forcibly leaving Michael's body, tearing out of him through any available opening, leaving Michael collapsed on the floor, his purple, rotting skin now empty again. No organs, no animatronics, just a hollow vessel that should be completely dead, that had every reason to stop functioning, that should have been a corpse days or weeks ago, but somehow wasn't quite, somehow retained enough of whatever made Michael himself that he could move, could stand, could look in the mirror and see what he'd become. A purple corpse, a walking dead man, eyes sunken and skin mottled, everything about his appearance suggesting death except for the continued movement, the persistence of consciousness, the stubborn refusal to actually die despite having every reason to do so. Michael Afton had become something like his father, something that persisted beyond death, though Michael's form was more grotesque, more obviously wrong, more clearly a corpse that should not be ambulatory but was, animated by remnant or guilt or the particular curse that seemed to afflict the Afton family, keeping them alive past the point where death should take them, forcing them to continue existing in forms that were violations of natural law that should not be possible but were, that marked them as things that had crossed boundaries that should not be crossed, that had paid prices that could not be fully calculated, that were living but not alive, dead but not ended, stuck in states between that had no proper names because they should not exist. This transformation, this scooping and wearing and ejection and survival, marked a turning point in Michael's existence, because now he understood firsthand what his siblings had experienced, what it meant to be trapped, to be transformed, to be something that existed in violation of natural law, to be bound to the Afton family's curse not just through guilt, but through direct physical experience. His body now as much a violation as the animatronics that had killed his siblings. His existence as impossible as Elizabeth's consciousness in Circus Baby. His continued survival as much an affront to nature as William's persistence in springlock suits and digital forms. Michael's mission after this transformation became clearer, more focused, driven by direct experience rather than abstract guilt. He would find his father, would track down William Afton wherever he was hiding, whatever he was doing, and would end him, would stop him, would burn him if necessary, would destroy everything William had built if that's what it took to end the cycle of death and transformation that had consumed their family, that had turned children into animatronics and brothers into corpses and fathers into monsters. That had made the Afton name synonymous with horror across decades and locations and forms that included human, mechanical, and things that were neither or both. Years passed with Michael searching, surviving encounters with haunted animatronics, working various jobs at Fazbear Entertainment locations, following trails that led to his father's suspected whereabouts, driven by the dual purpose of stopping William and ending his own cursed existence, seeking either redemption or destruction, unable to distinguish between them, unsure if there was any difference given what he'd become, given that survival might be worse than death when survival meant walking around as a purple corpse, as an animated violation of natural law, as proof that the Afton family was cursed at the most fundamental level, that they could not die properly, could not end cleanly, could only continue in increasingly grotesque forms until something or someone destroyed them thoroughly enough that even their stubbornness could not persist. Michael's final mission came when Henry Emily, his father's old partner, contacted him with a plan to end everything, to lure all the haunted animatronics to a single location and burn them, to destroy the remnant that kept souls trapped, to finally give peace to the murdered children and death to the Afton family members who had become animatronics or corpses or things in between, to end Freddy Fazbear's pizza and everything associated with it in fire hot enough to erase even remnant, even consciousness, even the stubborn persistence that had kept Michael and William and Elizabeth and the murdered children trapped in cycles of death and haunting for decades. Michael agreed to help, took the job at the pizzeria simulator that Henry built as a trap, managing the location while luring in the animatronics one by one, salvaging Molten Freddy and Scrap Baby and Lefty, containing the puppet containing Charlie Emily, and somewhere in those shadows, Scrap Trap, William Afton himself, the father Michael had been seeking, finally present, finally reachable, finally within range of the fire that Henry planned to set. the fire that would consume everything, that would be Michael's final act of atonement, staying in the building as it burned, ensuring the animatronics couldn't escape, guaranteeing that this time the fire would finish what previous fires had started, that the Afton family would finally, completely, permanently end. On the final night, as Michael sat in the office knowing what was coming, Henry's voice spoke through the speakers, addressing each animatronic in turn, offering explanations, apologies, promises of rest, and, to Michael specifically, Henry said, "I am remaining as well. I am nearby. This place will not be remembered, and the memory of everything that started this can finally begin to fade away, as the agony of every tragedy should." Henry understood that Michael was in the building, understood that Michael had chosen to stay, to burn, to end his cursed existence alongside his father and sister and the other animatronics, and Henry approved of this choice, validated it, promised to stay and burn as well, both of them accepting that ending Freddy Fazbear's Pizza required their own destruction, that some stains could only be removed by burning away everything they'd touched. The fire came, temperatures rising as the building's heating systems pushed beyond safety limits, as ventilation sealed and exits locked, as the pizzeria became an oven designed to destroy remnant, designed to kill things that shouldn't be alive, designed to finally end the Afton family and everything they'd created or become or touched. Michael sat in his office as flames surrounded him, as the heat became unbearable, as his purple skin began to char, and his consciousness began to fragment, and he must have thought about his brother, about his sister, about the family they'd been before the tragedies, about whether this fire would finally give him the peace he'd been seeking, the end he'd been denied for so long, the release from guilt and curse and the burden of being the last Afton standing, or at least the last Afton who wanted to end rather than continue, who sought death rather than persistence, who understood that sometimes the only appropriate response to becoming a monster is to let yourself burn. Michael Afton burned in Henry's fire, his body destroyed, his consciousness hopefully released, his mission accomplished because his father was also burning, because Elizabeth was burning, because everything that had made the Afton family a source of horror was being consumed by flames hot enough to destroy remnant, to break the bonds that had kept them trapped, to finally grant the ending that had been delayed by stubborn survival, by guilt-driven mission, by the curse that kept Aftons alive past the point where they should have died, making them continue in forms that were violations of nature, violations of decency, violations of every law that said the dead should stay dead, and families should be able to rest. But even this was not entirely the end, because Aftons never truly died, never fully ended, never stayed gone when fire claimed them, and fragments of Michael would persist in some interpretations, in some readings of subsequent games, perhaps as a consciousness lingering in the burned remnants of the Pizzaplex, perhaps as a protective presence that watched over what came after, perhaps as nothing, finally at rest, finally ended, finally free from the guilt and curse and family legacy that had defined his entire existence from the moment he put his brother's head in Fredbear's mouth until the moment flames consumed his purple corpse decades later. Let Michael's story settle over you now like ash from burning buildings, the understanding that guilt can drive people across decades, that atonement can take forms that include death and transformation, and walking around as an animated corpse, that brothers who kill brothers through cruelty can spend lifetimes trying to undo what cannot be undone, that some families are cursed not by supernatural forces but by their own actions, by fathers who neglect and experiment, by brothers who bully and regret, by cycles of violence that continue because no one can find the strength or means to end them until someone like Henry builds a trap, lights a fire, and finally burns away everything that should have burned long before, should never have been allowed to persist, should never have trapped people in states between life and death where guilt and curse and stubborn survival combined to create existences that were neither living nor dead, but something worse than both. Drift now toward deeper sleep, carrying Michael's burden without being crushed by it, understanding his journey without having to walk it, knowing his fate without having to suffer it, resting in safety while Michael, wherever he is, hopefully rests as well, hopefully found peace in that fire, hopefully ended his cursed existence and his guilt-driven mission, and his decades of walking around as a purple corpse seeking his father, seeking atonement, seeking any conclusion that would let him stop, let him rest, let him finally be dead in the way he should have been dead when the scooper removed his organs, in the way he deserved to be dead after killing his brother, in the way he needed to be dead, to escape being an Afton, being part of a family that couldn't die properly, couldn't end cleanly, couldn't do anything except continue in increasingly horrific forms until someone burned them thoroughly enough that even their stubbornness had to accept defeat, had to release, had to finally, mercifully, end. Sleep, knowing that Michael's story is one of the saddest in the FNAF universe. A boy who became a bully, who became a killer, who became a victim, who became a corpse, who became a hunter, who became Ash. Each transformation worse than the last. Each stage driven by guilt or curse or the mission to undo what couldn't be undone. Each moment of his life after his brother's death defined by the attempt to atone for what he'd done, to stop what his father was doing, to end the cycle that had consumed his family. And finally, in Henry's fire, perhaps he succeeded, perhaps he ended, perhaps he found rest, or perhaps, because he's an Afton, he continued in some form, some fragment, some presence that watches over what came after, unable to fully die because Aftons don't die, don't end, don't rest, just transform, just persist, just continue being cursed in new ways across new decades in new forms that violate natural law and human decency in equal measure. Rest peacefully now, far from Michael's guilt and curse, far from bodies scooped and worn and animated by Remnant, far from the Afton family's particular brand of tragedy and horror, safe in the knowledge that you are not cursed, not guilty, not transformed, not walking around as something that should be dead but isn't, not driven by missions that span decades, not burning in fires designed to end what cannot otherwise end, just listening, just learning, just drifting toward sleep while Michael's story fades into background, into history, into the lore of a family that destroyed itself through negligence and cruelty and obsession, that created monsters from normal people, that turned birthday parties into tragedies and families into collections of haunted animatronics and purple corpses and consciousness trapped in metal, that proved that sometimes the worst horrors are not supernatural but simply the result of one person's choices rippling through generations, destroying everyone they touch, creating cycles that continue until someone builds a trap and lights a fire and burns away everything, everyone, even themselves, because that's what it takes to end an Afton family curse. Complete destruction, fire, ashes, hopefully, finally peace. Part 5. William and the family he destroyed. The cycle complete. Continuing with William's ultimate responsibility for his family's destruction. As we return to the center of the Afton family tragedy, as sleep deepens and the narrative circles back to its source, we must examine William Afton not just as a murderer of other people's children, but as the architect of his own family's destruction. The father whose choices systematically killed or transformed each of his children, whose neglect created the conditions for every tragedy, whose obsessions took precedence over the safety of the people who should have been most important to him, whose legacy is a family that exists entirely in death, in transformation, in forms that violate the natural order. A family that cannot rest because its patriarch built machines that trap consciousness, that bind souls, that prevent the peace that should follow death. William's relationship with his family was characterized from the beginning by emotional absence, by prioritization of work over relationships, by the particular coldness of someone who could provide material comfort while withholding emotional warmth, who could create animatronics that entertained thousands while ignoring the children in his own home, who could research consciousness and death and the preservation of identity while failing to understand or value the living people whose identities included being his children, his wife, his family, his responsibility to protect rather than endanger, to nurture rather than neglect, to love rather than treat as inconvenient variables in the equations of his work. The crying child's death should have been a moment of reckoning for William, a tragedy so profound that it forced examination of priorities, recognition that his work had killed his son, that the Springlock animatronics were dangerous, that bringing his family to his restaurants was inappropriate, that perhaps his partnership with Henry and his development of entertainment technology had costs he'd been unwilling to acknowledge but could no longer ignore. Instead, William's response was to deepen his obsessions, to see his son's death as data about consciousness and remnant, to study what happened when someone died in close proximity to animatronic machinery, rather than to grieve, to change, to become a better father to his surviving children, to recognize that he bore responsibility for creating the conditions that led to the bite of '83. Elizabeth's death was even more damning because it occurred after William knew animatronics could kill children, after he'd lost one child to Fredbear's mechanical failure, after he'd witnessed firsthand the consequences of bringing children too close to his creations, and yet he built Circus Baby with the capture mechanism inside her, placed Elizabeth in proximity to this animatronic, warned her inadequately about the danger, and when she died, when Circus Baby grabbed her and crushed her and absorbed her into machinery, William's response was not horror at what he'd done, but fascination with what had happened, confirmation that his theories about remnant were correct, that consciousness could be bound to animatronics, that his daughter's death proved everything he'd been working toward. that her transformation was success rather than tragedy, data rather than loss, progression in his research rather than catastrophic failure as a father. Michael's transformation from son to victim to purple corpse occurred under William's shadow, if not by William's direct hand. The scooping room where Michael was disemboweled, created by William, or for William's purposes, part of his larger system of animatronic facilities and remnant research. The circumstances that led Michael to Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, created by William's work, by the choices William made, by the legacy William left, by the family dynamics William established where Michael was so consumed by guilt that he walked willingly into a death trap, seeking atonement for sins that were ultimately traceable back to William's negligence, William's example, William's failure to be a father who prevented his children from killing each other through bullying or killing themselves through approaching animatronics they'd been told were dangerous. Mrs. Afton, whether she became Ballora or simply disappeared or died from grief, was another casualty of William's choices. A woman who tried to hold together a family that her husband was systematically destroying through negligence, who lost 2 children to her husband's creations and 1 child to guilt over the first child's death, who couldn't save anyone because the source of danger was her own husband, the man she'd married, the father of her children, the person who should have protected them, but instead built the machines that killed them, who should have grieved with her, but instead retreated into research, who should have changed after the first tragedy, but instead continued creating conditions for subsequent tragedies, who made it impossible for Mrs. Afton to succeed as a mother because William was failing as a father in ways that created dangers she couldn't anticipate or prevent. The complete destruction of the Afton family, the transformation of every member into something other than human, the scattering of their consciousness across animatronics and purple corpses and digital viruses and burned husks, all of it traces back to William, to his choices, to his obsessions, to his fundamental failure to value his family above his work, to see his children as people rather than potential test subjects, to recognize that being a father required emotional presence and active protection, rather than just financial provision and occasional visits between research sessions at facilities where he was learning to trap souls and bind consciousness and do things that should never be done, that violated natural law, that created the conditions for his own family's transformation into the very things he was studying. William's fate, discussed extensively in previous explorations, was to be burned repeatedly, to die inside a Springlock suit and persist as Springtrap, to burn at Fazbear's Fright and survive as Scraptrap, to burn in Henry's Trap and fragment into digital consciousness as Glitchtrap, to continue in diminishing forms across decades, never fully dying, never finding peace, always coming back in worse forms, more damaged forms, forms that were less human and more monstrous with each iteration, the universe apparently punishing him through the same mechanism he'd used to trap his victims, keeping him conscious and aware, and suffering long past the point where death would have been mercy, making him experience the exact fate he'd inflicted on the children he murdered and the family he destroyed. Consciousness trapped in metal or code, unable to rest, unable to end, unable to do anything except continue existing in forms that were violations of natural law and human decency. The irony, if such a dark pattern can be called ironic, is that William achieved what he sought: persistence beyond death, consciousness preserved after physical destruction, identity maintained across transformations. But the achievement brought only suffering, only degradation, only the experience of being trapped in exactly the way he'd trapped others. Poetic justice delivered through mechanisms he'd created, studied, and understood better than anyone. The expert in remnant becoming remnant's prisoner. The scientist studying consciousness becoming consciousness's victim. The father who destroyed his family becoming the final casualty of his own work, when Henry burned everything, and William fractured into forms that were barely recognizable as having once been human, once been a father, once been part of a family that he'd systematically destroyed through prioritizing research over relationships, animatronics over children, work over family, obsession over love. The Afton family's story, viewed complete, is a tragedy in the classical sense, a downfall caused by the protagonist's fundamental character flaw, William's coldness and obsession magnified across a family system, destroying not just William but everyone connected to him, everyone who shared his name, everyone who depended on him to be a father instead of a researcher, everyone who had the misfortune to be born an Afton, or to marry into the Afton name, because that name became a curse, became synonymous with death and transformation, and persistence beyond death in forms that were worse than ending, became a name that meant you would not die properly, would not rest peacefully, would continue in some form, some consciousness, some fragment, trapped by remnant or guilt or stubborn refusal to end, bound to cycles of violence and seeking and burning that would continue across decades until finally, hopefully, in Henry's fire or in subsequent destructions, the Afton family found the peace that had been denied them in life, in death, in all the states between. Let the weight of the complete story settle over you now like a heavy blanket. The understanding that William Afton was not just a murderer of strangers' children, but the destroyer of his own family. That every member of the Afton household was killed or transformed by William's choices directly or indirectly. That the crying child died because William built Springlock animatronics and brought his family to a location where those animatronics performed. That Elizabeth died because William built Circus Baby and inadequately warned his daughter about approaching her. That Michael became a purple corpse seeking atonement for sins that ultimately traced back to William's failure as a father. That Mrs. Afton disappeared or died or became Ballora trying to cope with losses that William caused. That the entire family structure collapsed under the weight of William's negligence and obsessions and particular brand of monstrousness that combined technical brilliance with emotional void, that created animatronics that could trap consciousness but couldn't create family bonds, that understood remnant but not love, that succeeded at preserving identity beyond death but failed at the basic task of keeping his children alive, protecting his family, being a father in any meaningful sense. The Afton family exists in FNAF lore as a warning about priorities, about obsession, about the dangers of valuing work over family, about what happens when someone with brilliant technical skills and complete emotional void becomes a father, starts a family, creates children who need things he cannot provide. Emotional warmth, attention, active protection, basic recognition that they matter more than animatronics, more than research, more than anything, and when those needs go unmet, when those children are raised in the shadow of animatronics that command more of their father's attention than they do, when tragedy strikes and the response is not change but deepening of obsession, then the family structure cannot survive, cannot persist, can only collapse, can only transform into something broken, into scattered pieces, into consciousness trapped in metal and bodies walking around after death and children seeking parents and parents ignoring children and every relationship twisted by remnant and negligence and the particular curse that comes from being part of a family where the patriarch is a monster and the mother cannot protect anyone, and the children kill each other or die to their father's machines, and no one escapes. No one survives intact. Everyone is marked by horror. Everyone is transformed. Everyone becomes part of the nightmare because that's what it means to be an Afton, to carry that name, to be part of that family structure, to be bound by blood and remnant to the man who destroyed everything he touched while pursuing immortality and understanding, and goals that meant more to him than the people who should have been most important. Drift now toward final rest, carrying the complete Afton family story, understanding their tragedy from beginning to end, from the seemingly normal family in Hurricane, Utah, to the scattered consciousness and burned remnants and purple corpses and digital viruses that represented their final forms, from father and mother and 3 children to William and Scrap Trap and Glitch Trap and Burn Trap, to Mrs. Afton, vanished or dead or Ballora, to the crying child dead at his own birthday party, to Elizabeth trapped in Circus Baby, to Michael walking around as a purple corpse seeking redemption through fire, to a family that existed across decades and locations and forms but never together, never whole, never at peace, just scattered pieces of what should have been, what could have been if William had been a different kind of person, if he'd valued family over work, if he'd protected his children instead of building machines that killed them, if he'd been a father instead of a monster disguised as an entrepreneur, if he'd loved instead of obsessed, if he'd connected instead of isolated, if he'd been anything other than what he was, cold and brilliant and obsessed and emotionally void and responsible for every tragedy that befell the people who shared his name. Sleep knowing that the Afton family's story is complete, is documented, is understood in all its tragic dimensions, that their suffering is recorded and witnessed and mourned by those who study the lore, that their transformation from family to fragments serves as warning and cautionary tale about what happens when genius is divorced from ethics, when fatherhood is divorced from emotional presence, when work becomes more important than the people who depend on you, when animatronics matter more than children, when remnant research takes precedence over family safety, when every choice, every priority, every moment of negligence compounds toward a catastrophe that destroys everyone, that leaves only scattered pieces, that creates a legacy not of innovation or entertainment, but of death and transformation and consciousness trapped in forms that should not exist, persisting when they should end, continuing when they should rest, bound by curse and remnant and guilt to cycles that repeat across decades until someone finally, mercifully, builds a trap and lights a fire and burns everything, hoping that this time the fire will be hot enough thorough enough, final enough to let the Aftons rest, to let their story end, to let their suffering finally, permanently, completely cease. Rest peacefully, listener, far from the Afton family's tragedy, far from animatronics that trap consciousness, far from fathers who destroy their families, far from children who die or transform or walk around as purple corpses, far from families that cannot rest, cannot end, can only continue in increasingly broken forms, safe in the knowledge that you are not an Afton, not cursed by that name, not bound by those cycles, just listening, just learning, just understanding from distance, just carrying the story without being crushed by it, just drifting towards sleep with the knowledge that families can be destroyed by one person's choices, that legacies can be entirely tragic, that names can become curses, that sometimes the worst monsters are not supernatural beings, but simply fathers who failed, who neglected, who prioritized wrong things, who built animatronics instead of relationships, who created death traps instead of safe spaces, who researched remnant instead of providing emotional presence, who destroyed their own family as thoroughly as they destroyed strangers' children, who became the source of all tragedy, all horror, all suffering that befell everyone who shared their name or lived in their house or tried to love them, despite their coldness, despite their obsessions, despite their fundamental inability to be anything other than what they were: brilliant, cold, obsessed, destructive, and ultimately the architect of their own family's comprehensive and complete annihilation. The Afton family is gone now, scattered or burned or transformed beyond recognition, no longer existing as a family but as separate fragments, as individual tragedies, as pieces of a larger horror that defined the FNAF universe, that created the conditions for everything that followed, that served as the original sin from which all other tragedies flowed. The broken family at the center of every cycle, every haunting, every murder, every bit of consciousness trapped in metal, everything traceable back to William Afton's choices and the family he destroyed through making them, the wife and children who suffered the consequences of his negligence, his obsessions, his particular brand of monstrousness that combined technical genius with moral void, that built marvels while destroying people, that preserved consciousness while failing to value life, that succeeded at everything except the things that mattered, the things that would have kept his family intact, alive, together, at peace, happy, normal, any of the things that families should be, but that the Aftons never were and never could be, because William made it impossible, made it tragedy instead, made it horror, made it the story we tell now as you drift toward sleep. The cautionary tale about families destroyed, about fathers who fail, about children who die, about consciousness trapped and persistent and suffering, about everything that can go wrong when priorities are wrong, when love is absent, when genius serves obsession instead of people, when the Afton name becomes synonymous not with success or innovation but with death, transformation, tragedy, and the particular horror of a family that cannot rest, cannot end, can only continue being broken across decades and forms and variations until finally, mercifully, hopefully, someone burns them thoroughly enough that even Aftons have to accept defeat, have to release, have to finally, permanently rest. Good night, listener. Sleep peacefully. The Afton family's story is told, their tragedy complete, their fate sealed, their rest hopefully achieved. Let them fade now into history, into lore, into cautionary tales about families and fathers and choices and consequences, while you rest safely, far from their curse, far from their tragedy, grateful that your family story is not theirs, that your name carries no curse, that you can simply sleep, simply rest, simply dream of anything else, anywhere else, any family but the Aftons, any father but William, any children but those who died or transformed or walked around as purple corpses seeking redemption that probably never came, probably couldn't come, because some sins are too comprehensive, some families too broken, some tragedies too complete to allow for anything except burning, scattering, hopefully ending, hopefully finally at peace in whatever comes after remnant is destroyed, and consciousness is released, and families that existed in fragments across decades finally cease their impossible persistence, and accept, at last, the rest that should have come long ago, that was delayed by curse and remnant and stubborn survival, that arrives finally as ashes, as silence, as the end of the Afton family story, as the completion of a tragedy that began with negligence and ended with fire, that consumed everyone who carried the name, that left no survivors except memories, lore, cautionary tales about what happens when families are destroyed by their patriarchs' choices, when children pay for their fathers' sins, when mothers cannot protect anyone from machines their husbands build, when everyone becomes part of the horror, everyone transforms, everyone ends up trapped or dead or walking around as things that should not be, until finally, mercifully, the story ends, the fire burns, the Aftons rest, and we who listened can sleep peacefully, far from their tragedy, grateful for the distance, carrying their story but not their curse, understanding but not experiencing, learning without suffering, as we drift away from the complete lore of the Afton family, a household destroyed, a legacy of horror, a name that became synonymous with tragedy, forever remembered but hopefully, finally at rest.